may be valid complaints or valid solutions to some of these problems here, but then you have things like what happened at Evergreen, which we talked about in one of the videos in the previous series. Oberlin had a 14-page document of demands of social justice about like this many black people should be hired, this percentage of black professors, all this. Of course, Oberlin did the opposite of Evergreen and stood their ground and said, no, we're not doing this. The Ivy League schools, of course, have spent millions on this. They cite the numbers in the book, but I think like Yale has spent like 60 million. Someone else spent 50 million, all that. So the Ivy Leagues are trying to schools are trying to outwoke each other essentially. But there is an interesting pattern that should be pointed out here. So students demand money and power and tenured positions for departments where they learn these ideas. So for example, usually it's in English, literature, comparative literature departments, anything ending in studies. You get where this is going. And these departments are also the most tuition-dependent departments with the fewest available sources of outside funding. So again, we can get into the merits of what they're complaining about. Is it valid? People may think they're genuinely doing the right thing, but also consider who pays for this and who benefits. Like, it's a little suspicious that students come out of these departments and then they say, give these departments more money, and then the professors who taught them would benefit from that. That should at least raise some questions. And also, too, to sort of touch on what you said, colleges are probably the safest place in the world for women and minorities. Like this whole thing about women, 1 in 3 women will get raped on college. It's bogus. They went around, they asked women questions like, did you have sex while drunk? Did you have sex and regret it? All this. And then everything was counted as rape. And then they just use that to say, so it's like, if you were to actually break that down, no, it's not going to be that. It's just, they redefine words and then use that to goose the numbers. And then the question is like, well, why aren't these activists more active in countries like Saudi Arabia where homosexuals get thrown off of buildings and other things like that? And is that, well, it's easier, it's safer, and there's more to gain. They can get more tuition money, whereas you go to Saudi Arabia, you protest this stuff, you'll get killed, probably publicly executed. So the analogy here is that students are the Baptists, the faculty are the bootleggers. Now, are the students just pawns for the professors to get more money and everything? Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. Again, we don't know what's in people's minds, but this does seem suspicious if they come out of these classes, they're pushing for more money, and then it benefits these people who are teaching them this stuff. So it's at least worth asking. Any thoughts or comments?
That's a good way of looking at it, where there is a relationship here. It's not just the students, it's not just the teachers, it's not just the administration. It's a trinity of self-interested parties with different kind of things that meet at the table and say, hey, let's eat together. Yeah. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're not pointing the finger at any one group and saying, "Oh, you're bad. You're the worst of the sort." But it's about being able to actually deal with things and not just painting with a broad brush. Like you mentioned, as we had in the conversation with the 1619 project, I think that is an excellent thing with the Georgetown thing, where some of these times you say, "Okay, you pointed out an issue, but what is a specific issue and how do we address that specific issue in an appropriate manner?" And that's a simple thing. If you can show this was actually bought with slaves, with proceeds from selling slaves, this is a very practical and way to do it, not just broad brush, use a fire hose and just spray everything around. The other one was what did I write down here? The safety in colleges thing, that is a good point. And that's also it was very few I think it was 2 or 3 actual studies, such a limit how they define the actual term. And then many other people kept re-quoting that one thing. Somebody would source that thing and then they'd say, okay, it's from this source. And then these 2 or 3 other blogs or these 2 or 3 other articles wrote about this, then that will count as 5 sources in the article you're reading. But if you actually go look at all those articles, there's all quoting back to the same study. It might even be different sections in the same study. Sometimes it's the same actual graph that they talked about from that study without actually going into how the terms were defined. Like somebody will say a scale of, I thought like it was, how much was it? I was complete blackout drunk. I had no choice, into I felt coerced because I was going to get made fun of the next day. That's all put on one thing. Oh, sexual assault, and sometimes sexual assault is equated to rape. There are these things. All rape are assault, not all sexual assault is rape. That's kind of something to keep in mind when
But again, it's I've harped on this a few times, but it's like the thing with the so-called pay gap. It's like, how did you arrive at that number? You're comparing total earnings of men versus women. Then you have to get into which of those women took time out of work to raise children. What about in individual fields? Okay, like, well, sorry, let me back up a bit. So, like, what if you talk about like general studies? Like, okay, if more women go into social sciences as opposed to hard sciences, well, there's more demand for the STEM field, so they're going to pay better. And then in individual fields, like I know Christina Hoff Summers pointed out, in medicine, what is it? More men go into cardiology, more women go into pediatrics. Cardiology pays better. So it's like there's all these things to look at. It's this one statistic is gotten and then it just gets repeated endlessly. Or like we talked about in 1619, the thing about 50% of the Southern economy was from cotton. Well, how did you get that? Through a faulty calculation. But it's one of those things that someone latches onto and then it just gets repeated endlessly and nobody looks at where did this actually come from and how did you arrive at that number? So it's like, if for me, what it is, if certain things seem a bit off like this, it's like I like to look into it and see how they arrived at it. And if it's like, if it was faulty calculation or distortion or false equivalency or whatever errors they made, it's worth re-examining at very least.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. This has been a clip from an actual longer recording that I'll try to leave a link to on the screen or somewhere around here where you're listening to this.
Presents. 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 Presents.
Peasants.
Okay. Okay.